welcome everybody. My name is Laura Carfang. I am the founder and executive director of SurvivingBreastCancer.org. We are a nonprofit charity that supports those diagnosed with breast cancer and their caregivers, families, and loved ones. And we partner with other organizations to really bring to the forefront the issues that show up in my inbox every single day. Abigail and I go way back to, I want to say 2018, when I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she opened up her home to William and I when we were doing a meet and greet down in Miami. And ever since then, she has been helping me advocate and carve out this amazing space for the metastatic breast cancer community. She has counseled and mentored me on a number of topics, language, consultations, etc. So I am forever grateful for the work that you have helped me mature as a person as I'm helping to empower those diagnosed with breast cancer. So thank you so much for joining us tonight and extending this invitation to your community. And this is part one of a 7-part series where we are talking on topics that I feel has bubbled up from the MBC community when we want to talk about grief, how to talk about loved ones, how to talk about estate planning, how to talk about anything that kind of comes up. And what I love about my relationship specifically with Abigail, and why I'm so honored that she reached out to our organization, is that you and I have been on podcasts before. You and I have talked before about the stage 4 versus the early stagers. And I'm an early stager. I'm sorry, guys. I'm just going to put myself in that category. But because of you, you make me feel like such a smart, educated advocate for just all breast cancer, regardless of stage, regardless of type and category. And I love meeting, and just prior to this call, we were talking to some women with very different types of breast cancer that need the light shone on them. And that's really what I want to do. I want to, through educating myself, I'm educating the rest of the world. And I am so grateful to have all of you here tonight as we turn things over to Abigail and her community. And as we talk about the anticipatory grief, we have a fantastic lineup of panelists. And Abigail, do you mind if I turn it over to you to introduce who we have here?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So want to add my words of welcome as well to everybody tonight who's watching either in Zoom or on the Facebook Live. And I have to say I am so grateful to everybody who's going to participate tonight, but especially Laura, because I have brainstorms and I sent her a list of things and she says, yes, let's figure this out. And so I really appreciate that. She also made a comment a little while ago that to be friends with me means that you're going to be asked to do things that might be slightly uncomfortable. So anybody who gets to know me knows that I do. I call on people to talk about the things that they know about. And that's why this panel tonight, and I'm so excited about bringing you the stories from each of the women who are going to talk to you tonight, because they're talking from their experiences, from their own personal experiences. And let me just back up and talk about MBC Grieving Together. So Allison Tischler, a couple of months ago, commented on a post of mine where I was talking about grief. And she gave me a label for the grief that I was feeling for those that we lose in the MBC community. And her label was disenfranchised grief. And that concept is for those types of grief that are not mainstream, quote unquote. So the grief that doesn't follow the pattern that our culture expects, which is you get past the funeral and then you stop talking about it because it makes people uncomfortable. And that's my own personal evaluation of how our culture views grief. I'm sure that everybody has their own personal experiences with it, but I was really struggling because I was grieving for people, some of which I'd never even met in person. And giving a label to it really, really, really helped me because I didn't feel abnormal. I didn't feel like I was doing something or experiencing something that wasn't real. And so the whole webinar series that I pitched to Laura, and she said yes, thank God, because I couldn't do all of the technology stuff behind the scenes. We're going to be talking about those things that aren't discussed mainstream in the mainstream culture. You probably won't be able to talk about these things at Thanksgiving or Christmas. There's going to be family members who are going to be uncomfortable with the things that we're talking about. There's going to be friends that are uncomfortable with it. And in my view, that means we end up not talking about them. And I don't think that that's a good, healthy way to deal with what we are all dealing with. People, whether you're in the United States or elsewhere, everybody is going to deal with grief eventually. You're going to lose a pet, you're going to lose a parent, you're going to lose a friend, whoever it is that you're grieving for. And so while those of us who are living with metastatic breast cancer, who are living with something that is terminal, and honestly, I would throw a lot of there are people who are early stage in that too, because when you have to face your mortality, when there's this serious diagnosis, you just look at things differently. And so that's how this came about. MBC Grieving Together is now a Facebook page. We also have a website. And so if any of the discussions today spark something in you and you would like to write about that, we have a blog. We'd love to have people write about their personal experiences with grief. If you have questions that you would like answered in future webinars, please provide that information. We are learning and growing together. But I wanted to start our series with the process of getting ourselves ready for our eventual death, as well as our families, those closest to us. So I wanted to start with what's closest to us, and then we're gonna work outwards is how I've looked at this series. And so what I want you to be thinking about today as we tackle anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief is the grieving process that begins prior to a loss. And people who are experiencing anticipatory grief are actually working through the stages in advance of something negative happening. And to me, that grief really is the price of love. So when we love, and when we love deeply, we are then going to grieve deeply. And so, just be thinking about that, and consciously or unconsciously, just be thinking love. Replace grief with love, because that's what it really is. Grief is showing us that we've loved someone, that we've loved perhaps our life, that we love the people in our lives or the circumstances, whatever it is, you've attached meaning and you've attached love. And that is why people grieve. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the wonderful women who have agreed to join me today. So Amanda is in Orlando, Florida. And she has 3 degrees from the University of Central Florida, who had a terrible football game this last weekend, so just don't mind that. But she got her bachelor's, master's, and her doctorate in healthcare administration and health leadership from the University of Central Florida, which is, of course, where I went to school, so that's why I'm talking about it. And she is currently an assistant professor at Advent Health University. For those of us who still call it Florida Hospital, it was Florida Hospital, and now it became Advent Health University. Amanda has 2 boys. She has a son in college, which obviously she doesn't look old enough to have a son in college, and also a high schooler. And in 2018, Amanda was diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic breast cancer. And earlier, before we got started, we were talking a little bit about the blog that Amanda wrote for survivingbreastcancer.org. And so I'm not going to steal any of that thunder. Please go read it. It was really amazing. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons that I asked Amanda to talk today is not just because she is living with stage 4 metastatic breast cancer, but also because she lost her husband in 2016. Oh. And so she has the experience of parenting and walking through the grieving process with her boys after her husband passed away, and now also living with a terminal diagnosis and also walking her sons through that as well. So she brings that rich experiences to the panel today. So next I will turn to Ginny. So each of them are going to share a little bit more about their story. I'm just giving you an overview here. So Ginny Mason who has an RN. I didn't realize that, and a BSN. So she's got all kinds of letters after her name. Amanda does too. The letters after your name is kind of one of those things. I feel like when you're younger, or at least I was set out to have as many letters as possible after my name. I always notice that now. So anyway, Ginny has the experience of inflammatory breast cancer, which a lot of people don't know a whole lot about, and she's going to educate us about that as well. But she is the executive director of the Inflammatory Breast Cancer Research Foundation, which if you guys don't know about this group, it is amazing. I for inflammatory, B for breast cancer, I'm sorry, B for breast, C for cancer, research.org. So ibcresearch.org. Definitely check out their website. Ginny has a list of publications and involvement with so many different things. Again, I'm not going to steal her thunder. She has been in the advocacy space for more than 20 years and has a wealth of information to bring to everyone. And one of the reasons that I asked her to speak on the panel today is that I saw a beautiful picture on Facebook where she was holding her grandchild who was born at a difficult time in her diagnosis, and she was able to talk about how she wasn't sure that she was going to get to see that granddaughter grow up. So she's going to talk about what it's like to be dealing with a serious illness and also being a grandparent at the same time. So thank you, Ginny, for joining us today. And then we have Anne, who is on vacation at the moment. So very grateful that she was willing to take some time out of her vacation to join us today. She has been living with cancer since 2009 and had DCIS early in 2009 and then diagnosed metastatic in 2016. Anne has lobular cancer, which is a whole other animal. Mm-hmm. And has learned how to adjust her life to her experiences with breast cancer. So she was a partner in a public relations agency, and in early February of this year, she went on long-term disability. And so I'm sure she can talk about the difference going from a career to not having a career in the middle of dealing with a terminal illness. I'll be moderating today, but I'll also be talking about the experiences of living with metastatic cancer and having young children. When I was diagnosed stage 4 de novo in 2017, my boys were 1 and 3. And so the process and the experience of talking with kiddos who are younger versus kiddos that might explain or might understand it in a different way, that's part of what we want to talk about today, this process of living with this anticipatory grief, our families living with this anticipatory grief of those of us having a serious illness, but then also expressing that and talking with the children of various ages. But what does that look like? So I'm going to turn to Amanda first and just ask you to introduce yourself, give a brief outline of your cancer diagnosis, where you're at currently, fill in any blanks that I left out with my brief introduction.
Thank you, Abigail and Laura. Thank you for having me this evening. As Abigail mentioned, I was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer in 2018, so I'm almost at the 2-year mark. And I was also diagnosed de novo, which means that I did not have an earlier stage diagnosis. I remember the day of diagnosis well. It was December 18th, and I got my biopsies back. They took 4 biopsies, and all 4 from my breast and lymph nodes came back positive for malignancy. And so naturally you think, okay, we're gonna have, chemo, and I'm gonna lose my hair, and this is the road ahead. But the very next day, I went for a PET scan and then found myself in the oncologist's office that afternoon, and he said it's stage 4, and it had spread to multiple bones. In fact, I think I counted at one point and it was over 20 different bones in my body, and it's like you're hit with awful news, and then it becomes even more awful, because I didn't even think that I was going to be walking this journey. I was 38 at the time of diagnosis. I'm 40 now, and it's been a journey. It's been a journey, and I'm in active treatment. I see my oncologist monthly. I take 2 different pills every day. For those that are familiar with Ibrance and letrozole, that's my current first line of treatment. And I also have Zometa bone infusions to build and strengthen my bones. And so I've had scans, of course, every 3 to 4 months, and I had a period of being stable, and the last set of scans showed some progression. And so we're taking a watch and see approach to see what happens in the next couple months, and I might be changing treatment lines. So it's a tough journey, and all of you know that well. But I'm at the same time thankful to be here, and to be here with my boys each day is truly a gift.
And so, Amanda, how did you share your diagnosis with your boys? And if I can make this a compound question, what did you do differently than you might have in terms of talking with your boys, given the fact that they've lost their dad?
Yeah. I remember telling them, and I thought, we play out these scenarios in our mind. If it's this, then I'll say these things. If it's not, then it'll go this way. And I remember thinking through telling them. There was never a question about what to tell them. They were 12 and 17 at the time of my diagnosis. And, we had continued to walk through so much grief. And I've learned that honesty is really the best policy. And sometimes I have to temper that with things that they're able to process. There's a difference between being honest and being brutally honest. And so I find just being honest and sprinkling in, some things to have gratitude over. And that's hard, right? That's so hard. When we had just walked through 2 years prior, losing my husband and their dad, and that's forever kind of threaded through our story. And that's been the hardest thing. And then I remember my older son saying, when I told him what the doctor was telling me, he said, "Mom, I don't know what could be harder than what we've already walked through." And so it was as if my boys knew, we know how to do this. We do, but we don't. But we know how to do hard. I mean, that had been so much of our journey previously. And so we just continued to pull up our bootstraps. I remember having the conversation with them, and I actually had it separately. And this was something that just came to me in the moment. But 2 boys, 5 years apart, very different levels of processing. And in my mind, I thought I would sit down with both of them together. But the way that it worked was as it should be. I had a separate conversation with each of them. And I think that was for the better. So their questions were very different as we were processing. And my youngest was really more concerned about, can I catch it? Are you contagious? What is this going to look like, moving forward? And my oldest, who was really sitting in some of the deep, deep parts of grief, really started connecting the dots that, okay, our dad is not here, and what does our life look like if our mom is not here? And so we've had all of those hard conversations, and it's not easy. It's not easy at all. But at the same time, I don't know how to do it other than show up and be honest about it.
Thank you, Amanda. Do you think that the conversations would have been different if they were different ages?
Yeah, I do. I think, younger kids process differently. The things that they are concerned about might be very different. And older kids are able to cognitively connect dots and think ahead. And I realized early on, if I don't tell them, if I don't answer them honestly, they're going to Google it. You know, they're smart. Kids are smart these days. And so I'd rather them hear things from me and hear it honestly as they're able to process those things instead of just pretending or sugarcoating something. And I do think their ages, again, they were 12 and 17 at the time. Now they're 14 and 19. I do think their ages allowed for discussion, harder discussion, but in my mind, important discussion that I probably would not have been able to have if they were younger.
All right, Ginny, can we come over to you now? You can introduce yourself, and same second question. How did you share your diagnosis with your children, grandchildren?
Well, you gave me a very good introduction already, Abigail. Worked very hard for those extra initials. Because when I was diagnosed, I was a licensed practical nurse. I had planned to go back and be a nurse midwife. I was working, trying to save up money and to have my daughter graduate from high school so that I could go back and get my master's and then be a nurse midwife. And then cancer derailed those plans. I was just 40 years old, no family history of cancer of any kind. So I was really blindsided when I started having what I thought were just perimenopausal symptoms. You know, I was a nurse. I thought I knew women's health issues fairly well. So when I had redness and pain and swelling of my breast, I thought, no point in going to the doctor. They're going to tell me you're 40 years old, you're perimenopausal, you're overreacting. So I didn't go. My husband saw me step out of the shower one morning and said, "Your breasts look sick. Have you been to the doctor?" And I said, "No, this is what they're going to tell me." And it's not typical for him to say go to the doctor, but he did. He said, "You really need to get that checked." So I did, was sent for the, classic mammogram. My family practice doctor is a good friend who said, "I don't think this is anything serious." And when I had the mammogram, I said something to the technician and she said, "Oh, it does look a little funny." She said, "Wait and we'll have the doctor read it." And then she came back in a few minutes and she said, "You can go home, it's fine. They didn't see anything." And I said, "Well, you saw my breast, it doesn't look right." And you have to know that 26 years ago, I was a good, quiet pastor's wife. I didn't make waves. Cancer changed that. But do you want to talk to the radiologist? It took every ounce of courage I had to say, yes, I do. And this little man, I'm almost 6 feet tall. I've lost some height. But this little man came out and just very cocky said, "What's the problem?" And I said, "Well, you should see my breast. It doesn't look right." And he said, "Told you, it's fine. Stop whining. Go home." He said, "You're a nurse, right?" And I said, "Yes," because I used to work in that hospital. And he said, "Hypochondriac nurse. Go home. Stop whining." So I went home and my family doctor called and he said, "Your mammogram came back okay. It's probably a cyst that's blocking fluid. Those are common in women in their 40s. So of course I drag out my medical books and look, and sure enough, it does say that that's something fairly common in women in that age range. So I don't want to be the hypochondriac nurse. So I just put up with it, and it just got worse and worse. And back to the doctor's office, and they tell me no caffeine, no, take ibuprofen, which I was already taking for arthritis. But it took almost 5 months before I finally got sent to a surgeon who immediately, well, he didn't say anything right then. He did a biopsy in the office, and I got the results the next day. And he told me, it's not good when the surgeon sits down across from you and takes your hand. And I was expecting to be told I needed gallbladder surgery as well. And he said, "Well, I hoped we got to that at some point in time, that I had this very aggressive breast cancer on a scale of 1 to 10. This was not what you want." And in my usual glass half full kind of way, I said, Well, I didn't know I wanted any. And I expected him to chuckle. His expression didn't change. And he said, it was very serious. He said, they're waiting for you down in the oncology suite to start chemotherapy. I hadn't taken my husband with me. I didn't expect to be told I had cancer. This was a Friday about lunchtime. But we went down, I met the oncologist, told them that I could not start chemotherapy right then. I had clients waiting at my mental health clinic office for the afternoon. I was also scheduled to take care of my 3-month-old granddaughter over lunch break while her mother could go to the doctor's office. And I said, I just can't do that today. I don't have time. And I said, besides, I can't call my husband and say, come pick me up. I've just had chemotherapy because I can't drive. So I said, I'll come back on Monday. Let me tell my family what's going on, make arrangements at work, and I will be here on Monday. So they made an appointment for 1 o'clock on Monday for me to start chemo. And I promptly went back to work and didn't tell a soul what was going on. My daughter brought the baby in, my granddaughter, who, as I said, was 3 months old that day. My daughter was still having some postpartum issues, and having been an labor and delivery nurse, I wanted that taken care of. So I'd made arrangements for her to go someplace to see a doctor I trusted. And probably having that hour with my granddaughter was the best therapy I could have, because till my daughter came back, and I vowed I was not going to tell her anything until we had a chance to really sit down appropriately and talk. But I had myself together when she came back, and I just casually said, why don't you and your husband come out for dinner this evening? I said, or maybe just maybe better not offer dinner. And she later said she should have known something was weird, but and I worked the rest of the afternoon. And it wasn't until I got ready to leave work that I told my boss, the psychiatrist I worked with, what was going on and that I needed Monday afternoon off. And I'm one of these crazy people that worked throughout my treatment. But telling my daughter was tough. Here she was, a senior in high school, had chosen to get married, had a brand new baby. And, how do you tell your only child who's 17 that you probably won't see her child make it to a year? Because I was told I had 18 months to live. It's hard enough to go home and tell my husband that as we were getting ready that year to celebrate our 25th wedding anniversary. And so it was, at least I had a chance to tell him first. I had planned this scenario in my brain on my drive home from work. It took me 30 minutes to get home. And of course I walk in the door and it's pouring rain and I just say, I'm going to die. And my husband, I should say, is also a pastor, recently retired. So there were many times I watched him switch into pastor mode to deal with things. As awful as it was the year before that to deal with a teenage daughter, getting pregnant and wanting to get married and all the challenges of that, through that experience, I learned that I can't control what happens to me. I can only control how I respond. And that prepared me to be able to deal with the cancer, I think, because I realized at first it was, why did this happen? But within a few hours I was why not? What makes me special that it wouldn't be me? And I have to decide how I'm going to handle this. And it's not going to go away, but, it's up to me. So I think that set the tone for what I did then for the rest of my experience with my cancer. My granddaughter was just an amazing help to me going through my treatment. For me, the fact that I was going to be a nurse midwife, I love babies. I wanted to sit and just rock her. That was probably better for me than the chemotherapy, I think. It was therapy. She didn't care that I was bald and, dark circles under my eyes because I did chemotherapy before surgery. I'm not stage 4. I always joke and say I'm stage 3 and 3C, which is 3 3/4. We're always on the edge of waiting for that other shoe to drop. And I have had 4 times I've been told I was metastatic, but later came back after biopsies that it was not. They were all treatment-related issues. But I certainly have lost so many friends to inflammatory breast cancer, since a third of us are metastatic at diagnosis, and another third become metastatic during the course of their disease. So it's a place that we have experience, whether we want to be there or not. So I feel like I've dealt with it vicariously. I've done a lot of that anticipatory grief and a lot of grieving for those that I care deeply about, that I've met in 21 years of working with other patients.
Thank you for sharing that, Ginny. How did your daughter respond when you told her?
I don't think at the time she realized how serious it was. And admittedly, I probably downplayed it a little for her benefit. But I think there were some real benefits in the fact that she didn't see me 24 hours a day, because she was so wrapped up in trying to finish school, take care of a baby, newly married, and living in her own house. So she wasn't at home with me all the time, so that I could kind of control the times we were together, and she would see me probably at my better times. Or at least I would try to make it that way. It wasn't about a year and a half later, when we were all surprised that I was still alive, that I think it really hit her how serious it had been and how close she came to not having her mom.
Jenny, I have to say, first off, thank you so much for sharing your story. Your experience holding your grandchild, I have to say I had something very similar holding my niece. And we talk a lot, about like these therapy dogs or things that can help with anxiety. And, you go to these conferences and they bring these beautiful golden retrievers that like we fall in love with. I was holding my like 4-month-old niece. She was wrapped up in like the little cocoon, bundling. I'm like, she's kind of like a therapy baby. And I'm like just holding her. And I'm like, therapy baby. Like this just like brought me so much joy. And, as you're describing like holding your grandchild too, it's just like, there's some things in our lives that don't necessarily need articulation, but that just bring us that wholeness and satisfaction. And I just wanted to share my experience with that too. And that totally resonates.
I'm glad that you could experience that as well.
All right, Anne, can we come over to you? If you could share a brief outline of your diagnosis and treatment, and then how did you share the information with your daughters?
Yeah, thank you. I don't have all those fun little letters after my name, but I can definitely relate to everybody else's stories. Certain parts and pieces, I think, kind of puts it all together. So in 2009, I was 38. We were trying to get pregnant again. We had some eggs on ice, as we called it. And so I was taking estrogen. I had the estrogen patches, and I had just this awful lump in my breast. And I went to the doctor right before Christmas, and he said, no, you have no family history. You're way too young. You just have dense breast tissue. So I did all the caffeine, you take all that away and everything. And by February, I was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer. And it was DCIS on my right side. It had gotten into some of the lymph nodes. But, I was told, and I remember distinctly, because I've had the same oncologist for 11, 12 years now, this won't kill you. Like, we can get you through this. It's going to be the worst year of your life, but we can get you through this. And my girls at the time had just turned 5. I realized when we finally sat them down to tell them that they clearly didn't know the different parts of your body, because they told everybody that I had hip cancer, which had a lot of people questioning, who has hip cancer at 39? So we figured all that out, and we dealt with that. I also did the whole neoadjuvant chemo. So we had to tell them pretty early that mom was going to lose their hair, and they were good. I think, Amanda, you hit on it earlier. They take their cues from their parents. And so we tried to, again, at that age, they hadn't even started kindergarten. We tried to set the tone that we're going to work hard. Everybody has to do their part. That means washing your hands, That means, not bringing in germs, blowing your nose and throwing away the Kleenex, some of the things that have come in handy with COVID. We started really drilling that in kindergarten as they were, processing all of this. They did a lot of, it wasn't like a therapy baby, but they would sit on our fireplace and reenact Calvin and Hobbes, like the funny facial expressions. They were learning how to read a little bit. And so that was a big part of how I spent my days after chemo and recovery and everything. And they were troopers during all of it. And I'm lucky that my husband was great. He hadn't been working at the time, so he was there to help. I also worked through all the diagnosis both times. We thought that everything was going really great. I made it past the 5 years on tamoxifen, hated that, but felt like, we'd done everything right. I was exercising, eating right, trying to do everything they tell you to do. And then I went in February of 2016, and I was training for a marathon, and I couldn't breathe. And I thought it was really weird, but I did my mammogram, I did my chest x-rays, they were all clean. And I talked to my oncologist. She's like, "You're great, you're fine." And finally, I just had gotten blown off enough that I called my oncologist office, and I'm like, "I'm not going to hang up the phone until somebody agrees to see my breast. I'm pretty sure there's something going on." And he got me in for ultrasounds, and the radiologist that day is like, "If you can't see the oncologist in the next 48 hours, call me back." So I knew right then it was serious. I went in, saw the oncologist, did the biopsy and everything. It turned out that it was lobular. Unfortunately, she called back and delivered the news while one of my daughters was in the car and my husband was out of town. So that is not the right way to tell your children. She shouldn't have heard it that way. And fortunately, everybody's kids are different. It was the one who was probably more grounded than the other one. So Rose did a great job of handling it. And we were on our way to buy pet food. And she's like, "Let's just go get the rabbit food, Mom, and then we'll get back in the car and then we'll cry." It's like, okay, good idea. So we persevered. We got the rabbit food. We got in the car, and then we let loose, and we cried and screamed. And I think the biggest difference, like from my oncologist perspective, was the first time I was diagnosed, he made it very clear that I could survive it if I could, make it through the chemo and everything. And as he started describing what he saw on the scans and where it was in the bones, and I had a pleural effusion and a pericardial effusion, and it didn't hit me that it was stage 4 for a long time. And then when he finally said it, then there was a whole string of the F word. And he was patting my leg the whole time. Somebody mentioned that earlier, that, when your oncologist is offering you that physical, I'm like, "Don't freaking touch me." Like, it just wasn't my way of playing. So, so that was tough. And I think, going home and explaining it to our daughter, and they know what stage 4 is. They've seen enough of our friends and family to understand it now. And I think that that's what makes it so much more intense. Every time I've just had to change treatment this year, and I think Amanda touched on it. You have to be very honest and very straightforward, because if I say it wrong, they're going to go upstairs and Google it, and God only knows, it could be worse, whatever they find up there. So I do try and make sure and make a conscious effort that we use the right language. We don't shortcut it, that, very clear that they're going to go look it up themselves, and they're going to Google what other people are saying about it and where it's all, what else can happen. So, I think that's a big part of it. Camp Kesem has been huge for them. I was diagnosed in May, and they were fortunate enough to go in August of that year to Camp Kesem. And that was just a phenomenal experience for them as well, just to see other teenagers at the time who were a few years ahead of them, and to be able to have those relationships has been really critical for part of their healing process and how they walk through all this journey.
Would you, Anne, give everybody just a brief synopsis of Camp Kesem? It's such a great organization.
Yeah, so it is a organization that's run by primarily local universities. So in my case, it's NC State, University of Chapel Hill also has one, but it's kids who are in college. It's run as a club who they take these kids away for 5 days to these amazing camps. Most of it's donated. And for 5 days they play. They used to have these amazing food wars where they're throwing food fights and all of that type of stuff. It's not exactly great use of food, but they're dialing it back and changing it up. But it gives the kids a chance to just be kids and not talk about cancer for a big portion of the week. But then they also do their own, they decorate the bags and they do the luminaries and why do you kesem? And kesem is the Hebrew word for magic. And I think it's such a special place for the kids because it's college-age kids who've often had some type of experience with this and have volunteered their time. They're not paid to be there, and they work hard year-round to fundraise and come up with the programming. Every kid goes by, they have like a code name or a nickname, so they don't even use their own names. My daughters are Guppy and Bloodhound, and a guy named Taco runs the whole thing at NC State. So, it's just a fun place for them to get away from everything. And I can't recommend it enough.
Thank you. And the one here at UM, they have a full-time psychologist who also works with them. I think most of them do. Well, they'll have the adult that's there just to make sure a child doesn't need anything extra. So it's such a good example of programs that help our families also handle this diagnosis, which becomes a whole family affair. Has your husband had caregiver support through this process of your experience with cancer?
We went on the Inheritance of Hope, another amazing program. And he did have some good discussions there. I can't say that they've been sustained through our church and some of the men there. I think that that's probably where he gets the most of his support. I'm not sure he's ever going to be, very extremely talkative about it. But he's also gone through cancer himself. He had testicular cancer in between my two diagnoses. So I think he understands it a little bit more than he did the first time, for sure, and what it means to hear those dreadful words of you have cancer. So, I think that's part of his journey as well.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. I did warn you guys that I was going to throw in some odd questions. So those were not on the script that I sent out. But I think a refrain that I hear from a lot of people is just that as much support as there is for those of us who are going through it, that oftentimes there isn't as much support for our support system. And a couple of the organizations that Anne mentioned, Inheritance of Hope, is a wonderful organization that sends cancer patients and their families on vacation. And then they have people in the community who really know what they're going through, who come alongside them as mentors. So that's a wonderful organization. There's also another one called Little Pink Houses of Hope. So just wanted to make sure everybody's aware of those things. Camp Kasem is a wonderful resource for children who are old enough. But as I found out with young kids, they have to be 6 before they can go. So it is important if you're looking for resources for your caregivers or for your support system that you think about those things. And I'll just give a brief synopsis of my diagnosis and how we told our kiddos. So in 2017, I was tandem breastfeeding my boys. They were 1 and 3 at the time. And I felt a lump and went to my lactation consultant, my primary care physician. I thought it was related to breastfeeding, but it wasn't. I do have a family history. My mother's at the time was a 16-year cancer survivor. And through the process of my diagnosis, we did find out that there was a germline mutation in our family, somewhat like BRCA, called ATM, like you get money from the ATM. And I have the distinction of having both ductal carcinoma and lobular. So basically your ductal carcinoma forms those lumps that you feel. Lobular, it looks a little bit like lace. And so this is what I had. I had a nice big lump that I felt, and then it was infiltrating deeper into the tissue like lace. It's actually kind of pretty on pictures if you didn't think about how deadly it is. So for about 2 months, we thought I was stage 2. I went through a lumpectomy, found out that I needed chemo. After my first chemo appointment, I got a call from my medical oncologist where he said that something was off with my blood work. And it turned out that I had been stage 4 from the beginning. And that lymph that I had not been complaining about for several months was a 5-centimeter tumor in the middle of my right femur. So I was in surgery within a week to have titanium rods put inside both femurs. And so within a matter of days, our lives were completely turned upside down. Just like Anne, my medical oncologist went from, this is a blip, you're going to get through this, this is not going to kill you, to at the next appointment, this is something that will kill you. And I appreciated how he, drew that distinction between what it was before and stage 4, because it was in my face and it wasn't there was no question what it was. And I think that one thing that is hard for a lot of people is just that doctors often don't use really strong, clear, direct language. I think some of that is because they're trying to not scare the crap out of you. But then sometimes I think that can backfire. And I think that that is a recurrent theme as you're hearing from everybody, to use the right language when you're talking to children, to be honest and not say something that isn't true in the moment, because it might fulfill a need in the moment, but you're going to then pay for it afterwards. So with my kids, we have not shared a whole lot of detailed information with them because they were 1 and 3 when I was diagnosed, and now they're 5 and 7. And so they know that mom is sick. They know that mom goes to the doctor. When I was diagnosed, my 3-year-old, who is now 7, his biggest concern was that the doctors were going to fix my run. So he would always ask when I came back from a doctor's appointment, is your run fixed yet, mommy? Because I went from being very active with my very active little boys to, I was in a wheelchair because I wasn't allowed to walk once they found out that my femur was about to shatter. And after surgery, I used a walker and then I used a cane because I had to learn, my muscles and my tendons and my ligaments had to get used to the change, that they were ripped apart so that they could put a drill down the middle of my bone. So that process meant that we had to do things very differently. And for me, I had to go from being an extremely active mom of young kids to being much more sedentary. But like everybody's talked about, our kids really do respond to how we're handling things and how we set things up. And so that's really just the way that we've done it. Is we can't say the word terminal to my kids. They're too young. Even cancer is somewhat of a hard word because there are so many connotations to that. And so we're very careful with the language that we use, but we talk about the importance, like Anne said, about what they can do, right? The washing their hands and being careful with their germs, and that there are just some times where they can't get up next to mommy, even though of course that's the only thing that they want to do. I just noticed too that if anybody is sick, or if any of their friends cry, or if any of their friends fall down, they're there right away. I feel like it's taught them to be a lot more empathetic. They ask more questions about that sort of thing. So just a little bit different from talking with older children. And so Amanda, I wanted to shift gears a little bit here, and again, ask you somewhat of a compound question here. So if you could share with us, what was the best question that you got from one of your boys after your diagnosis? And then what was the hardest question? And they could be the same questions. But if you could think about questions that they asked that may have been difficult to answer, or maybe a question that you got from one of them that seemed incredibly empathetic or incredibly profound.
Well, I'll back up for a minute because I realized I told you about my diagnosis, but not the story leading up to, and that kind of feeds into some of the questions that my boys had. So like Abigail, I also have a family history of breast cancer. My mom was an early stage diagnosee, and both of my grandparents, so maternal and paternal. And I had been under surveillance for 4 years with a breast care surgeon, 4 years. So I was going twice a year for ultrasounds, mammograms. I was going for MRIs annually. And every time I would go, for the most part, it was all clear, all clear, all clear. And all of a sudden it was, you have stage 4 cancer. And so you can imagine just the rage that first anger and then deep sadness that I felt, because I felt like the previous 4 years were pointless. And it's not easy to interact with our healthcare system. I mean, I teach about it, right? That's my day job, and I'm all for reform on every single front. And there are some providers that practice, and I'm a firm believer that they shouldn't be practicing. And I didn't have any capacity at the time to think about malpractice or negligence, but definitely something was missed along the way for 4 years to be given all clears. And so a lot of my boys' questions, the hard ones, were certainly about, Mom, why is this happening to you? You were doing everything you were supposed to be doing. You were doing everything the doctors told you to do. And now you have cancer, and it's stage 4. There is no stage 5. This is the worst possible stage. And so as a parent, I felt helpless, right? Trying to honor, right, the question, because it's a question that I had too, and to be able to meet them in that grief and just how they were processing through that without answering and being, full of rage and, having that moment together. I feel like there's a little bit of that can happen, but it then turns not helpful as you're trying to parent through it as well. And so a lot of the questions that they would ask me, I would have the response, I don't know, buddy, I don't know. And here's what I do know. And so I would try to respond in a way that made room for the unknown, but gave them something to hold on to. I don't know why it was missed in the previous 4 years, but I do know that I am an advocate for my health, and I am taking a front row seat, and I'm driving the bus, all the metaphors, right? And I'm going to make sure that nothing else gets missed. And so those were hard questions. I might be the one living with it, but they are too. They are living with it, and they're living with the unknown, and that they're still very young ages are trying to find ways to be secure in that. And it's really hard because I've had to surrender so much, and I'm watching them surrender so much, and it's difficult. But I would say probably the hardest questions are about what happens when I die. And, on one hand, maybe there's a blessing in being able to have these conversations with them preemptively. On the other hand, I wouldn't wish that on anybody. They're not conversations that you think that you're going to have with your children, no matter their age. And that's really tough. That's really, really tough. I would say, both of my boys have asked multiple times since the diagnosis, where will we go, Mom, if you pass away before I graduate from high school or before I graduate from college? And so I've had to have good plans in place, conversations with family, and ongoing, because things change, and it's always at the forefront, right? Where am I in my treatment? How is my body responding? What are the next steps? And how do I make sure my boys are cared for well in all of it? And giving them a voice in the process too. So a lot of hard questions. I wish I could say that they were all done after receiving this diagnosis, but I mean, it's ongoing, continually hard.
Do you have to temper what you share with them about your appointments or about the possibility of progression? How do you handle that ongoing conversation when you have had to face those things in recent months?
Yeah, I try not to process with them. They are not my go-to, right? They're my children. And so if I have anxiety before a scan or before an appointment, or I'm waiting for results that will show if things have progressed, I take all of that to my friends and my safe family members. The things that I talk to my boys about are really more concrete. You know, I had an appointment and this is what we talked about, or I got my scan results and this is what we're working with now. Trying to minimize some of that anticipatory anxiety, you know, fear, unknown, all of that. So when I come to them, there's a clear direction, or at least a clearer direction than if I were just to be, you know, throwing things out and processing with them.
Ginny, could we come over to you to talk about what was the hardest question that you've received from a child or a grandchild, and then what was maybe the most profound question, and they could be the same ones, that you've gotten from a child or a grandchild?
Well, because I've spanned such a long period of time now since that initial, I should preface the thing with what I'm going to say with this piece, that I wrote a letter to that grandchild. When I got to a year from my diagnosis, I thought my time was probably pretty limited, and I wrote letters to people that had been meaningful, and who had been really helpful to me during my treatment time. And I wrote one to her. She wasn't, you know, she was just a little over a year old at that time, and not knowing when she would be able to read that, but definitely not at that age. I wrote it, sealed it in an envelope, gave it to my husband, and I said, when you think it's appropriate, please give this to her. I said, I don't anticipate being around then, and I said, put it someplace safe and you give it to her. Well, as time went by, you know, she got to be like 10, and I thought, man, I can't believe I'm still here, but I have that letter, but nah, 10, she's not ready for that yet. So again, I'd say just keep it there. And I kept putting it off and putting it off. And she was going to get married, and she was 20, and chose to get married the day after my 20th anniversary of my cancer diagnosis. I took the letter to her when we went to help with the wedding preparations. And such an experience that was, as I gave her the letter, and of course it was a lot of tears, but I had no idea. I couldn't remember what I'd written in that letter 20 years later. But that was such a neat experience. But the questions that raised by some of her younger siblings, you know, why are you crying? What are you crying about? And they would notice my tattoo marks from my radiation, my little dots. And my daughter made it very clear I was not to call them tattoos. I was to call them something else. So they were my cancer dots. And trying to help some of my younger grandchildren understand what I had been through was really challenging, because it didn't compute to them. They only knew me as healthy. And fortunately, even my two oldest granddaughters, who are now 26 and 24, don't remember. I mean, the 26-year-old was a baby, but they don't remember that time, of course, and her younger sister doesn't at all. But my daughter was diagnosed with early stage aggressive breast cancer at 27. So that brought everything back when that happened. So the two older girls were around then. The others, of course, were not yet. But what that brought up lots and lots of questions, because by then they knew that many of Grandma's friends had not lived. And the fact that I was alive was helpful, but helping them understand that hopefully Mommy would do fine too, like Grandma had. But I realized how much they've been affected by what I do, even though we live 100 miles apart. They know, the older ones especially, my granddaughter who's now 13 has really gotten interested in what I do and asks me a lot of questions and wants to understand better about cancer. What does that mean? Why do you do what you do? And I think it's had given me an opportunity to hopefully help them understand a bit better. I've been the one that took my two oldest granddaughters out when they were about 14 and 15 for coffee to talk about, are you afraid? Now that you're getting breasts, the fact that I had breast cancer and your mother had breast cancer, I thought they wouldn't ask their mom, but they might talk to me about it. But I think trying to help them understand has been challenging. You know, the good news is I've done well, but every time I was in the hospital earlier this year because I had 2 massive blood clots in my lungs. I almost died. And the terror that came up again because they were convinced the cancer was getting me, and having to help them understand it wasn't cancer. It was actually, in my case, much scarier than my cancer has been. But I think, again, we were talking earlier about the importance of being honest. When they saw pictures of me with all this stuff going in my jugular vein, with the blood clots, for me to text and say, you know, I know I look scary with all of this in my neck, but you know, I'm doing okay, and you know, don't worry, I'll be able to talk to you on the phone tomorrow. Because I think honesty really, as everyone has said, it's so important to base what you say on the level of understanding of a child, but to always be as honest as you can, because younger kids in particular think everything that happens is their fault because the world revolves around them. And nowadays with the internet, you do know that older kids are going to go check it out. So, you know, if you're not honest, they're not going to trust you then, because they're going to think you're trying to hide something. And that's never a good way to manage things.
I'm so glad that those blood clots resolved and you're still here with us. That must have been a very scary time.
It was. This is my 3rd time to have massive blood clots. Second in my...
Wow.
Before it was a 2.5-inch clot in my inferior vena cava. So it looks like I'm going to be coagulated for life.
Wow. Well, and I would be remiss if I didn't say that once you've been diagnosed with cancer, that you do have a higher than average risk of blood clots. And a lot of times the medications we're on can raise that risk as well. So anybody who has been diagnosed with cancer or had cancer treatment needs to be alert to those things. But
you're also at risk for another type of cancer, since I had endometrial cancer last year after 20-some years.
Yes.
The good news is I got to live long enough to have a second one.
Exactly. There's always a silver lining. There's always
absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, Anne, can I pose the same question to you about hardest question, most profound question, or questions that your twins have brought to you since your cancer diagnosis?
Well, I think the best questions, I think, are when they ask questions they're just totally normal, because then it just feels like they're getting that sliver of normalcy as they develop their own breast, as they, you know, start to become young women. So that's been interesting. I think the hardest questions have been, and since I was diagnosed the first time in 2009, they've seen both of their grandmothers have cancer. One of their aunts have breast cancer. Several of my friends, now a whole, you know, nearly everybody I know on the internet seems to have breast cancer. Their father to have cancer. And so after someone called one night to give us their, you know, that they had been diagnosed and asked their questions, one of the girls asked me, "How old do you think I'll be when I get breast cancer?" Oh, and it just ripped my heart apart, because of course my hope is we find cures that, you know, and that was part of my answer. You know, that's why I'm doing the advocacy work. That's why I think awareness is so important, and you will be scanned regularly. But I think that night was probably one of the lowest nights, just watching from their perspective. Everyone seems to have it. And I miss the days of being naive. And I hate that that's been taken from them. That's one of the things that I definitely grieve, is that they're so familiar with what breast cancer is and what it can do and why it's so difficult to cure. Mm-hmm. And then of course, the other one that's really obvious is, you know, will you die from this? And, you know, I think when you're initially diagnosed and going through chemo and you have those hot spot moments when you're in the hospital or it progresses, or I've been in the process of changing treatment for the last few months, I think that one's the other one that's been, you know, really hard, of, you know, balancing that we all die sometime, which, you know, seems so cliche, with we're doing everything we can so that doesn't happen. And that you will never be able to say that I quit trying, like that I'm doing everything in my power to continue pushing that needle as hard as I possibly can. So, and then the other thing that I would say is, and I think, you know, others have touched on this as well, you know, we've talked about washing your hands and being careful, and especially in this COVID environment. One of my daughters is extremely sensitive to, she is terrified that she is going to bring something home. At the same time, she's a 16-year-old girl who's all about me and wants to get out there and live her life. And I honor that, you know, in so many ways. And so we've had a lot of discussions this year about, you're going to be exposed at school. You're going to be exposed when you're out there in the world. And if you bring it home, you're not the reason that the family gets sick. Like, I don't want them to live with that guilt. That's probably my biggest fear right now, is if we do get sick, you know, I hope that we can't tell where it comes in our house, because I don't want them to live with that. And that's such a burden that I see, particularly for one of the girls. And she does all the, you know, she wears the mask. She's very good at that type of thing. And she has a lot of empathy, as Amanda pointed out earlier. I think they've learned that by living in a family that's had somebody terminal for the last 4 years, but sick for many years off and on before that. So, you know, I think to me, I don't have a good answer for that, other than just to keep talking about it and making sure that there's that open environment and open door where we can talk about anything, and we don't hold one another. You do your best you can, and we all know that, you know, it's a possibility, and we're going to have to live our lives within that. And that's been a tough place to be this year. There's no easy answers for that one.
Have you found, Anne, that this time of progression and having to change medication, has it affected your children differently?
I'm not sure that they see the day in and day out differences of it. Because I went from Ibrance and Faslodex. I was on that for about 3.5 years. And I just started Afinitor and Letrozole, I think, or whatever they put me on with that one. So I'm just, like, I've done all the mouth sores, lost weight because you couldn't eat for a couple weeks, all that great stuff. I definitely see that there's like a layer of fear in them of, okay, if mom's not eating, that's serious because I love food. And, you know, what does that mean? And how can we help with that? So, you know, I definitely see that in them.
Well, we are going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the more tangible. I'm talking a lot about talking, about managing emotions. And I can say for a parent of younger children, I'd say the majority of the work that we do around that is helping the boys to identify and name their emotions. Because for the little guys, they're not always able to articulate those things. And so I did want to recommend, if anybody has young children, that if you Google conscious parenting and the feeling buddies, that's been really helpful. They're these little dolls and they have different expressions on their face. That way we can say, okay, are you feeling like this doll today or like this doll today? And that has really helped to help them name their emotions. And one thing, my dad's a licensed mental health therapist, and so he helps us a lot with identifying it. Anger is often the first emotion. And Amanda talked before about feeling rage and just feeling that anger. Anger is often the first emotion, but it's not what's really going on. That anger is typically the veneer that's over the sense of powerlessness or over the sense of helplessness or over fear. And so I have found that for my kids, because they're little, because they often interact physically, that a lot of what we have to do is sit with them in that emotion. Although I am sure that that is also something that works for older kids and adults as well, just to be present with someone, not fixing it, not telling them what they need to do with it, but just sitting there with their emotion. We do a little bit of, okay, are you feeling this way, buddy? Are you feeling that way? Which is helping give them a different vocabulary. And frankly, I feel like it's given me a better vocabulary to talk about my feelings. There's something about trying to help someone else articulate something that then makes it more real. What are we leaving behind? So I'll start with you, Amanda. If you want to talk a little bit about what you've put together to leave behind from your boys and why.
Yes. And of course, this is in process, right? I'm a writer, and so I have little notes and journals and books and little things that I'm writing for each of my boys, just things that I've learned along the way, and memories I want them to hold on to. And so I have those things going for them. I've also been really, not just since my diagnosis, but since losing my husband, really burdened to make memories with my boys. And that was something a counselor told us years ago, and we're all still in counseling and go as needed. I'm a big proponent of that, and I want to normalize that, especially with young men, just like you said, Abigail, naming feelings and all of that. But something a counselor told us was always have something to look forward to. And that can be hard when you're faced with a diagnosis like this, but that meant that we did a lot of traveling and even staying local. We're in Orlando, so we'd go to the beach and stay for a weekend, or we'd drive a few hours and go see a new area, or drive to the mountains. And I felt like every break from school, every holiday, we were packing in something to do to make memories. And that has continued after this diagnosis. Within reason, we've had to accommodate different things with bone meds and cancel a ski trip and things like that. But they love the water, right? So we can go to the beach. And so a lot of the leaving is memory making, and then capturing that through Instagram or making chat books. So pulling in pictures and captions and having multiple sets of these books, so they each have their own set of memories of things that we've done together. And so trying to be intentional about capturing those memories, but also being very specific toward each of them individually, and really using the time to tell them what I want to tell them. And so ultimately, I'd love to write a book that's in my, we'll see if I get to that. But really, write a book and dedicate it to them with just, musings from my heart, and we'll see. Yeah, but lots of memories and lots of things to leave them with.
You're speaking that into the universe here, Amanda. That means that we're all going to hold you accountable to writing that book.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Amanda. Ginny, how about you? What, other than the beautiful letter that you talked about that you wrote for your granddaughter, have you also put away some other tangible things for your family?
Things have changed so much in the time period from when I was initially diagnosed till now. Social media didn't exist back in those days. So one of the things I started doing was taking lots more pictures than I probably had before. In fact, I drove people crazy at family gatherings, making everyone sit down for family pictures. Because my mother-in-law died just exactly a year after my diagnosis. March of each year for 4 years in a row were just these, I knew something awful was going to happen. March one year, my daughter tells us she's pregnant, wants to get married. The next March, it's, I'm diagnosed with breast cancer. The next March, my mother-in-law dies after 2 massive strokes at age 70. And I'm like, forget March. I'm done with it. But I began realizing I had the last pictures of my mother-in-law at a family gathering. And I thought I was so grateful to have those. So I began, every time the family got together, I made everybody sit down and taking pictures, and I was really becoming a pain. They let me know. But I wanted to have those pictures. I thought, I think I was so aware that we don't know what's going to happen, and that those are tangible memories. Now we've got, all of this social media stuff so that Facebook reminds you daily what you were doing X number of years ago. But we didn't have those things. So one of the things we do try to, since we live 600 miles away from our grandchildren, we try, this last year's been challenging with COVID, but when we go to visit 3 to 4 times a year, we're there for about a week. Don't stay in their house. With 9 children in their house, you don't stay in their house. It's a little crowded. Plus you mess up their routine, which is not a good thing to do. But we started out, my husband took the 2 older girls to breakfast on their own. Well, as we got to have more and more children, pretty soon we couldn't just take them on their own. We'd have to stay for a month to do that. And he needed help when we got to having more kids. So the 2 of us would, one morning we take the kids who are 4 to 5 and over out to breakfast. And that's a really special thing to them, to get to go for breakfast with grandmom and granddad. They're incredibly well behaved, so it's actually quite easy. But they get so excited about being able to go and order their own breakfast. We go to a bagel shop that we all love. But, I hope that's something that will always resonate with them, since there's so many. Thank goodness we only have 1 daughter. We wouldn't be able to keep up with another family of a bunch of little children. But since we can't do a lot of one-on-one kinds of things with the kids, I just hope those will be special memories for them. And at some point, I don't anticipate living to the ripe old age that some of my family have done, given all the health issues I've had. But I want them to remember, that they had fun with us, that we did fun things together, but that we read lots of stories, and that there are lots of pictures of us doing things together. And I make sure we do have pictures of us individually with kids. And we make sure they have copies of some of those, and try to develop relationships with them that are a little more individual. And the other piece, and some of you, as you might, when I get into this, we do many long years ago stories with our grandchildren. It started with my father-in-law when our daughter and her cousins were little, that before they went to bed, when we had family gatherings, he would tell a story about himself as a child or the parents, these girls' parents as children. And so we passed that along. Now with our grandchildren, you have to lay in the dark to listen to them, and then they have to guess who the story was about. And so I hope I know that's a really special memory for my daughter of her grandparents, which my father-in-law is still here at 96. But I hope that's also a very special memory for my grandchildren, to think about those many long years ago stories.
Those are lovely examples. Thank you, Ginny. When I had recently become a parent, I read the line that children spell love Time.
I wanted to throw in one thing back to a previous comment when we were talking about how do kids process things, or emotion pieces. I was so distressed that I had people tell me that my daughter's pregnancy the year before caused my cancer, because they knew stress. They were just convinced stress caused cancer. And if she hadn't done that, I wouldn't have cancer. And I was terrified someone would say that to my daughter. The last thing I ever wanted her to think was that her choices, while I didn't appreciate them at the time, I never thought that caused my cancer a year later. But I had some people say that to me, and I thought, what an awful thing for someone to comment. And I thought, if she ever hears that, I would be devastated to have her think that she caused my cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Did
you ever talk to her about that? Oh,
I did more recently, because I thought at this point it's been long enough. It was probably fairly safe to say something about it. And she said she did have someone say that to her at one point, that if she hadn't done what she did, that I would never have gotten sick. And I said, because we just had the conversation, I said, people talk about stress and cancer. And I said, by all rights, if stress caused cancer to come back, mine should have been back, 8 or 10 times by now, because I've lost both my parents. I've had 2 grandchildren die, you name it. And I'm still here. So I think we have to be really cautious when we're looking at, we like to blame something. And that can be really dangerous.
Yeah, we did IVF, and somebody was kind enough to say to our daughters, and we've just started having the discussion about them, well, it could be all the drugs that your mom took during IVF that caused her cancer. I'm like, I don't care. I would take all the drugs again tomorrow to have those girls. I mean, that they are the reason I get out of bed in the morning. So absolutely, I just couldn't believe that somebody could say that. And I totally appreciate the stress comment too. I have heard that one many times over as well.
Would you like to share what tangible items you've set aside for your girls?
So like Amanda, I also write a lot. So I'm definitely writing, journaling. Hopefully some of them they don't find for years. But a few years ago, as we started doing more and more experiences very intentionally, I started collecting postcards. And so if we came back from a ski trip or the beach, the last thing I would do is go buy 2 postcards, and I write a note about what I loved about them at that time while we were there. And so there's just a whole box full of postcards of trips that we've done together. And then it kind of grew from there. So now, I have one of my daughters really wants to go to Iceland. So when somebody went to Iceland, I asked them, could you pick me up a postcard from there, a blank postcard? And so then it started where there's more aspirational ones as well. And I found it really daunting to write the letters. You have to write letters for Inheritance of Hope. And I've done that, and I've done it a couple times now. But I think the postcards are just kind of a nice snippet way. And maybe those are chunks that they can, look at 1 or 2 and put them away until they're ready to pick it up again. And then I've kind of had a wish list of things that I want to make sure that I get for them and tuck away, like a graduation gift from high school, although I really hope I'm here next year. But, whether that's earrings or a necklace or whatever. And then at the same time, I want them to have like a little bit of that sense of humor. And so one of my daughters, always loves those fake geese that people put in their yards. And she's like, when I buy my first home, I want a fake goose. So I have a fake goose in a box that only my husband knows is there. And it's, in 30 years or 10, 15 years, when she buys her first home, please make sure she gets this fake goose that she will look at it and probably scratch her head and go, why did mom leave me this? So I have written out how many times she's, commented driving down the road that she can't wait to have a fake goose in her yard one day. So, and her sister will be mortified. So, I'm trying to figure out what's the exact right type of thing for her as well. So, I think it's important to treat them as individuals throughout the whole thing. So that's been really important. But a lot of letters. I quilt, and I've tried hard to start on baby quilts for those granddaughters that I'm pretty sure, grandsons that, medically I've been told you probably won't see that happen. I'm having a hard time cutting the first piece of fabric to start on that. And maybe that's my winter goal for this year. But, I think you have to kind of figure out the pacing too. I don't want it to become like this death cloud over me all the time either. So, I try and do a few things here and there and then set it aside for a while. So
thank you for sharing that. I think it's so important to remember that in putting together things that you would leave for anybody, don't forget to be who you are. And if a sense of humor is part of who you are or how you deal with things, that just where it goes back to telling kiddos honestly what's happening, I think having whatever you do reflect who you are is so important. Kids are so good at figuring out if something's genuine or not, right? So I wanted to show you guys the boxes that I have prepared for my boys. So this is just it's a card box it was actually for a wedding. So I got each of them the box and had their names put on it. And in addition to letters, and the handout that we put together for you guys actually has a whole list, almost a page full of ideas for times that you might get a card for. So things, and to Anne's comment that sometimes a whole letter is hard to sit down and write, but a postcard or a card, like say for graduation or for their first baby or when they got their first job, or all those times, the way I've tried to think of it is all the times when you would pick up your phone to call your mom, having something to open for that particular moment. Now, certainly we can't think of everything. So I've got some thrown in there that are just, whenever you need an extra or pick me up or whatever. And so the idea being that on those times where you might reach the phone to pick up, reach for the phone to call your mom, that you could reach into a box to pick out a card. I've also found these super cool little books where you fill something in. This one is What I Love About Being Your Mom. And so this one, you've got the sweetest blank I've ever blank, right? So this one is for one of my boys, and you have the sweetest smile that I've ever seen. So I like these because they have little prompts. And I've also gotten a couple of these. This one was just off of Amazon. This is called My Mom, Her Stories, Her Words. And again, it's just a prompt that then you can write. So this one is, Mom, who were some of your favorite relatives and what made them special? So that I've also found to be helpful, again, with the prompts. Instead of just sitting down with a blank sheet of paper, because I could stare at a blank sheet of paper for hours. What I've also tried to do is when I am particularly low about something, dancing with my boys at their wedding. Not sure that that's going to be in the cards for me, but when I am thinking about something like that, I try to sit down and write a letter for them to open at that moment. If I don't get there, if I'm not physically there, they would have something to open in that moment. So I think all of those things it's so individual. And what ends up resonating for you is not something that might resonate for something else. a friend of mine who lost her husband to cancer told me at the very beginning of my diagnosis that it's important to remember to save pieces of you in a variety of different ways. And so certainly writing something down is important, them having your handwriting on a piece of paper, a card that you selected, but also not to forget to preserve your voice. And she told me about how there was this, back when we had answering machines with tapes, that there was this tape of their answering machine message. And it was literally her husband saying, leave a message for blah, blah, blah. And they played that over and over and over and over again until it was worn out. And I know that doesn't happen much anymore, but back when there were tapes. And so that does remind me that we are all 3-dimensional or 12-dimensional or whatever dimensions there are, but that we're more than just what's on a sheet of paper. And so remembering to preserve your voice as well. And there are a variety of companies that can help you do that. I did a video it's called Through My Eyes, THRU, My Eyes. And they are a nonprofit out of New York. And back when I did it, it was on Zoom, and it was this weird thing that someone was going to interview me on Zoom. Well, obviously that's much more commonplace now. And a video through My Eyes was simply my face, my words. They engage licensed mental health counselors or psychologists to ask the questions. But there are so many other things that you can do on your own. I mean, even just to the point of videoing yourself on your phone and just talking about whatever comes to mind, so that it's you, your mannerisms, the word choices that you would have. That's just another piece of who you are. And so the one thing I wanted to say about this idea of leaving something tangible is that there's no right answer. There's no wrong answer. It's just your answer. It's your answer in terms of individuals, like Anne was saying, each of the people in our lives, if it's children, spouses, godchildren, grandchildren, they're all different. And so whatever you do to preserve your memory with that particular child, it could be a duck for their yard. It could be something completely different, but it depends on your relationship with that person. And so just like we've talked about talking to kiddos or talking to other people, that honesty is key. I think that how you leave and what you leave and why you leave, those things, whatever they are, to whoever it is, that it's important to be genuine there too. And it's important for it to be a real reflection of who you are. So I've been trying to watch the time, even though, we could sit here and talk about these things for quite a while. But really quickly, I want to go to each of the panelists. And somebody did this to me at the end of a panel that I was on, so now I'm doing it, is to think of a word. What word exemplifies what you've talked about tonight and what you want to leave with everybody tonight? Amanda, can I go to you first?
The first word that came to mind was surrender.
Thank you. Ginny, how about you?
Genuine.
Anne, what about you?
Tough question. Nurturing.
Excellent. And my word that I want to leave everybody with is how I started. If you replace grief with love, I think that helps to frame how you do anything, whether it's grieving, whether it's leaving a legacy. Just think of that through the lenses of love.